everyone's doing well this morning or this evening or wherever you're watching from, whatever time of day it is. We have folks from all over the world in this group. So you might be watching at another time of day. Hope everyone is doing well. I haven't been able to do a live in a couple of weeks because my son was sick last week. I had planned to do it last week and he got sick and had to stay at home. So that did not bode well for doing a live, but he is better. Everyone's back in school. So it's Friday and we've had some new members join recently. So if you're new to the group, welcome. And I hope you're finding it useful and valuable. You're always welcome to comment or post things that you have questions about or things that you would like to discuss in the group. We're here to support one another. It's not just me trying to be the know-it-all. We all try to help each other. So if you have questions or things you want to discuss, everyone is welcome to chime in and talk about whatever you're interested in regarding parenting. So this week I wanted to talk a little bit about this topic of play fighting or rough and tumble play or whatever you want to call it. The type of play where kids are acting out with guns and swords and wrestling and all that stuff that causes parents to sometimes be concerned. We actually had a question from someone in the group, Elena. And Elena, I hope you get to see this. Maybe I'll tag you on here because it was actually a couple of weeks ago when she posted the question about that. And she had said that her toddler, I think he's almost 3, 2.5, 3, was really into sword fighting, pirates, all that kind of play that is common at that age. And she was just kind of wondering how to deal with it and whether, she should be concerned. And I think this is something that comes up very commonly for a lot of people, especially when your kids are about that age, 3 to 4. That's when all the pretend play really kicks in, right? And it's really cool to see that with your kids. I remember with my oldest, when he first started pretending, like pretend cooking or pretend drinking something and all that stuff started coming in, it was like, wow, this is really like prime time for the fun part of parenting to me, because you can pretend with them and their imagination just expands every day and it's really cool to see. So that stage of development in general, I think, is really fun for most of us. But this play fighting comes in at that time too, usually, and it can be a little concerning. So I wanted to talk about this, not just because it's a common issue, but also because in this parenting against the grain group, our whole focus is like looking at what's going on in parenting culture around us and trying to kind of figure out, okay, do we just go with the flow with like what other parents are doing, or are we going to do something different? And how do we discern that? And how do we figure that out? And so given that my background is a research background, sort of my approach with this is like, let's look at the research. Let's look at how we feel about this and what are our values around a certain topic. What does our intuition tell us, and try to balance all that out when we make a decision about parenting. And it sounds kind of complicated, but it's really just learning how to like take the research, balance our intuition and what we know about our kids, and put those things together. Because I think a lot of times when I first started, I think I was a lot more like, oh, let's just look at the research and I'm going to do whatever the research says. Well, sometimes, first of all, the research doesn't give you direct parenting advice sometimes, but also sometimes the research can inform us, but we still have to kind of look at our own situation, look at our own kids and how has their personality influenced the decisions we make. So that's what this group is about, is trying to combine research and sort of intuition and your own understanding of your child. And so this play fighting issue is a perfect example of trying to bring these two things together, the research information and our own parenting intuition. Because, if you listen to kind of parenting culture around this topic, a lot of it, you hear both sides, really. A lot of it, people will say, you'll hear people on the playground or whatever, your parenting friends, well, I don't want my kids to play with, play guns or play swords or any sort of fighting, any sort of, rough and tumble. I think it promotes violence. You hear that, right? Okay, so here's one side of the topic, that this promotes violence or that it promotes aggression. Okay, so you hear that side of the story, and then other parents might say, "Oh, well, it's just normal. They're just playing. It's no big deal. It doesn't promote violence or aggression." So you hear that side, and so it's sometimes kind of like, okay, what am I supposed to do here? There's people on both sides saying these two different things about play fighting, and so we all have to come up with our own understanding and feeling and how we want to handle this with our kids. Um, and so that's why I think this group is a good way to talk about this topic, because there are so many feelings on both sides of an issue like this. And again, like with any topic that we talk about in here, I'm going to put forth the research, but it's just as an informational thing, and you obviously have to come up and decide. I'm not going to preach to anybody about what is the right or wrong way to handle a certain topic. I'm going to present what the research says, and based on your own values and your own what works for your family, then hopefully that will help inform your choice about what to do with the situation. So play fighting, first of all, just from kind of a research perspective, um, is pretty much almost universal. We see it in kids. Kids who have never been exposed to violent movies or violent video games or violence in real life, they all do play fighting, whether it's swords, guns, rough and tumble play, wrestling. Pretty almost all kids do this, and so it's not any reflection on anything your child, generally speaking, is not anything that your child has been exposed to or anything that you have done. It's just a stage of development that almost all kids go through. I remember in grad school we watched this video. This is one of the videos that really stuck with me. We were talking about gender roles, and so they had this video of this family, and they had I think they had a boy and a girl, and they said, when our son was born, we decided we're going to have and try to raise him as gender neutral as possible in terms of like stereotypical things. Like, we're not just going to buy him trucks and, all these like boy toys. We're going to expose him to all things, dolls, trucks. Um, we're going to expose him to everything and just see what he picks. And the same thing with the girl. Okay, we're going to expose her to all toys and have gender neutral toys and just see what they decide to play with. Okay, that's great. So their son starts growing up, and when he turns maybe 3 or 4, he starts using carrots as guns, sticks as guns. He had never been exposed, he'd never had toy guns, never watched anything on TV or videos that involved any sort of violence, and he was playing cowboys, cops and robbers, shoot 'em up cowboy, the whole thing that the kids do, right? And they were very concerned. And basically what the video showed, and I think for the most part this is true, I don't want to get into a whole discussion of gender roles, but kids are always going to play this type of play for the most part, is what we have seen. And it is more common in boys. And for as hard as we might try to have gender neutral toys and gender neutral clothing, this kind of stuff is just something inherent in there. And researchers aren't completely sure why this is, but boys do tend to do this type of play more frequently than girls. Not to say girls don't do it, but it is a little more frequent in boys. So what we think is going on in terms of research perspective on this is that this play fighting is really a type of sociodramatic play. And that, like I was saying, that's a real common thing that kids go through around 3 or 4. They want to pretend everything. And the reason they do it is, first of all, they're imitating, the things they see in real life. So they'll practice cooking or practice doing the laundry or whatever that they might see around their house. But also, they're trying to understand the world around them. And part of understanding the world is understanding good and bad. And who in my world is like good and bad, for one thing. But then what does good and bad really even mean? So when we look at this from a child's perspective, they're still trying to understand what good and bad even means. As adults, we look at play fighting a little differently because we have an adult understanding of what's right and wrong and good and bad. And so, but from a child's perspective, they don't really even know how to distinguish how do we know a good person from a bad person. I remember about a year or two ago when my little one, who's now 6, he was about maybe 4 or 5, we had been talking about, in our family about kind of the general safety rules, right? When you're at the park, you don't go with strangers, and you would never want to get into someone's car that you don't know, all that stuff. And so he was understanding. He was at an age where he could grasp a lot of that. But he kept asking over and over, like, how do we tell when someone is a bad person? And so that really made me realize, like, he thinks kids think it's so black and white. Like, this person's going to have like a badge on them that says, I'm a bad person. And so that's the way they understand it, right? And so that's why that play fighting works for them and is kind of helpful from a psychological perspective, because they can identify in play fighting who is the bad guy. You are pretending to be the bad guy, I'm pretending to be the good guy, and we're going to battle, and the good guy's going to win probably. That is like very black and white for them. Okay, it kind of gives them a sense of understanding and a sense of safety, that these are the boundaries, this is the roles we're playing. But in real life, it's not that easy, right? And that's what my 5-year-old was trying to understand, like, because we were telling him, well, sometimes, a bad guy might act like a good guy. They might offer you candy, or, not trying to make him worried, but just things that we tell our kids, right? So that they won't go with strangers. And he's like, it's just confusing for them, because, like, how am I supposed to know if this person is a good person? How am I supposed to know? Like, if they're acting good, but they're really bad, how would I know? And so that's what goes through kids' minds, because they don't have the life experience that we have to know when someone's trying to trick you or something like that. So that is the role that this play fighting kind of takes up in their life, is like, I can clearly distinguish when I'm playing that this is a good person, this is a bad person with their friends, when they're pretending. So that's why it's helpful for them, is that it's the sense of safety that I can identify good and bad. And then from a whole other level, research has shown that this play fighting, especially kind of the rough and tumble play fighting, really does help build social emotional skills. And I had not really thought about this before, but when you think about what goes on when kids are wrestling, or even like pretending with swords and stuff like that, play swords, and they have to judge what the other person is feeling and their facial expressions, and like, am I pushing them too far? Is this getting too close to being real fighting? And so they have to figure out, like, okay, if I push him just a little bit, if we're wrestling and just play fighting, how do you know when it's gone too far? And so it takes some time for kids to understand that. And there always are instances where some child may not understand that they've gone too far if they, are play fighting and wrestling, and it gets into something that actually hurts somebody. Sometimes then, a parent would have to step in. But a lot of times, if you watch, kids learn how to regulate that themselves. It's really interesting to watch, especially as they get older. I have 2 boys, and they wrestle and play fight all the time, and they're older now. So the oldest one's 10 and the other one is 6. So the 10-year-old is pretty strong. And so he has really had to learn in the last year or so, what his limits are with his little brother. He can't like just pounce on him like he used to, because he's a lot bigger. He could really hurt him. And so we've had to work with him on, like, you have to recognize how strong you are, and that you can't like throw your brother across the room, things like that. But when kids are little, especially when they're of a similar size, they usually kind of figure out, okay, we're just playing and kind of wrestling, and they kind of can judge, like, not to push it too far. And that's actually what this play fighting is really helpful for, is they have to read those facial expressions, read and hear the person's voice when they're making sounds. Like, is that a real cry, or are they pretending to cry? And that's the kind of like social emotional learning that is very subtle, but is actually very helpful for them to understand, how do I know when I've gone too far and I have to stop, and this is getting like, it could really hurt somebody. And so parents can help, we can help them learn that. But and that, I think, is why it's often difficult, like in a school setting or a daycare setting, that they often really worry about and put a lot of restrictions on play fighting and anything like that, because it is really hard to manage if you're, in a situation with a lot of kids, and some kids kind of know where the boundaries are and some may not have learned that yet. it can get out of hand easily. And so that is where the tricky part comes in. And a lot of, I think, childcare settings probably don't allow that kind of thing as much, at least, because it does have the tendency, it could, get into something that could hurt someone easier. But in your own home, you can decide whether you feel like wrestling or play fighting amongst your kids is okay, and whether they have the, learn that ability to kind of judge what's too hard and what's not, and you can judge that for yourself and see whether you think that will work. But it is helpful to know that some level of play fighting, and even with pretend swords and stuff, there there have to be boundaries in place, but that it does help them sort of judge where that line is, where they push it too far and where they're just playing. In the research literature that I was reading through, and I had written an article about this a while back, and I was reading back through it, and the way that they kind of define play fighting is that it has to always be cooperative between both parties involved. So both people involved know that they're pretending. And so that's real important. Like if you get the sense that your kids aren't on the same page about what's happening, then that's sometimes where it breaks down. But if they both know we're just pretending, we're not really hitting each other, we're not really hurting each other, we're just playing, then usually, that has a tendency to go better. So what else with, and another thing in terms of the research, and this was interesting to me as well, research shows that only in 1% of play fighting do actual injuries occur. So it is actually a very small percentage where some person in the play fighting scenario pushes it too far and someone actually gets hurt. So that was kind of interesting to know that is not that common, although it does happen, and we have to be on guard for things like that getting out of hand, but it actually does not happen all that often. I'm not quite sure how they measure that, but I guess they've done maybe reports of play fighting situations, and they've been able to determine that only 1% actually kind of devolve into some sort of somebody really getting hurt. So again, the main differences between play fighting and, real violence or fighting that you should worry about is this idea that in play fighting, both the people involved know what's going on, that it's just pretend, and they're both cooperating with that, and they understand the situation. And also,